Let's resume. Just there's like important half. We haven't connected our database yet, so let's get to that. What do we do once this form is submitted? One last thing that's left with this form is once all of these fields are filled, we need a submit button. So let's create that. Right after all of our divs, we can have a button element with a type submit. So the submit attribute. Following that, we'll still need styling. So class, btn primary. Okay, within opening and closing tags, let's just write submit and save this, refresh our server. When we go back, refresh the page, this is what it looks like. And we leave it at that for now. What we need to do next is, okay, in server.js, we created a route that rendered our new.egs file. So we created the pin route to render our new.egs file. And we did go ahead and create our form as well. Now that this is all set up and ready, what happens once this is submitted? So this route simply, we forgot a semicolon, but this route simply displays or renders new.egs for us. It doesn't deal with the data that gets sent back. The reason we know that is because this is using the get method. So the two possible values that method could hold is get and post. When this form is submitted and we are posting the form's information to this route, it's currently not being dealt with in server.js. We need to create a separate route for that. So app.post. So this is a first, it's new. We haven't worked with post methods before, but when the user submits the form, the post method, we are going to again create a same route. Both the routes have the same name. This one's called pin, this one's called pin as well. The difference is that one is simply rendering our form using the get method, and one is using the post method to deal with the same form's information. For the sake of simplicity, we have this both of these dealing with the same page. The root name is the same. However, the method is different. So when the form gets submitted, we will create a route over here that will deal with the data that comes from the front end, Mr. Comma here. So app.post pin async, again, same. The rest of our formats the same, request response, create a function, and we'll add code in here. But at this point, we need to make sure our database is ready. So let's say we do receive information. Okay, our forms created is rendered, the user has submitted information, and we have a route now that's going to deal with the information that gets posted. What do we do with it? We need to store it in the database. So let's quickly go to MongoDB. So a lot of switching, a lot of back and forth, but MongoDB Atlas. So we never use Mongoose, just it's a different product that Mongo provides. We are using MongoDB Atlas. You see Atlas is written in the top left corner. In here for this project that we'll use as an example next class as well, our Pinterest board, let's create a new project, a separate database. Since MongoDB is free, Atlas is free, we can create as many databases as we'd like. I clicked on the Atlas page. We don't have a project for our Pinterest board right now, so I'm going to click New Project. In here, we just need to give our project name, so I'm going to call it Pinterest. That's what my database will be called, or my project will be called. Next, let it be default, create project. In here, of course, if you want to connect with our database, we need to build one first. So our Pinterest project shows in this top left corner. Pinterest is written here. Clicking on it shows us other projects. So Coding Challenge 6 or Week 7 code. We have all of those databases here as well. Currently, we'll focus on the Pinterest project. Under the database option on the left side panel, you can see that it's currently empty and it's prompting that you must create a new one. So let's build a database. Okay, the free tier. Are we going too fast? Is it good? Okay. In here, you can change this name. So I just prefer having it being called cluster. Okay, so inside our project, we are building a database. Make sure you've selected the free option. If so, click create to proceed. Oh my God. Okay. Selecting all of this. All the traffic lights. Okay. It's a lot of verification. Okay, now that we have this, I'm simply going to set a password that I remember, and we will use this to connect with the database. So that's the next step or your last step. You create a user. So the username will come automatically. If you work with MongoDB by now, you know the username comes. Password is something you need to save and remember. I'm going to keep it simple for now. And over here, currently, we have this Humber's IP address that we are connected to. But in order to make sure that when I go home, I'm able to access your code if you submit it to me, easy way to do it is by making sure your code is accessible from anywhere. Or sorry, your database is accessible from anywhere. To do that, we could go to network access, or here there's a shortcut for it right now while we're in the setup stage. So let me click on it real quick. And here, over here, currently, if you don't do this step, it's fine. But during setup stage, it's best to do it. You can either go to it from here during setup by clicking on this. Else, on the left side panel, under security, we have network access as well. For later, if you've forgotten to do this step, that's not a problem. You can go back. But under network access, in order to make sure this database is accessible from anywhere, even if we host it on AWS, we'll add a new IP address and allow access from anywhere. That sets the range to be this, and this signifies that 0.0.0.0/0 says that essentially you can access this database from anywhere. So if it's hosted on AWS, locally, whatever it might be. So confirm. Let's go back to our previous tab while this setup takes place and simply hit finish and close. Okay, go to
it added both already? Both IP addresses?
Yeah, even if that's not done right now, again, for now it should be good. It's added mine. Has it added yours?
It's included in your access, but I'm not sure if it's in the cluster.
Okay. So we can check by just going to network access. Yeah.
So it just means it's sorry.
Exactly. So now that we've created our database, it should be visible to you. You should be redirected to this dashboard. And that's all we had to do in MongoDB for now. Okay. Are we all here at this stage? Yeah.
Where's that?
Oh, if you just click on database, it should get you here. Now, whenever you want to connect to your database, you should come to the database page. And to check what you currently have in there, you'll select the Browse Collections option. And you'll see that currently we have nothing. Going back to this Overview tab or just clicking on Database, here we have the option to connect with our current cluster. So we're going to click, yeah. Yeah, just click on database over here. It brings you to this page. That's okay. Yours looks a little different. Yeah, that's correct. And just clicking on the sheet.
Okay, I clicked this and then it turned into that.
That's all right. So again, browse collections will show you that we currently have nothing on here. In order to add something to this, we need to connect it to our code locally. So we'll connect it in a second. We haven't set up our database locally yet. So again, I'm going to close any of our previous tabs. And this folder in the folder structure provided to you, you can see that there's a folder called database. Within that, you have database.js. Okay. And there is part of your code that is provided to you. Firstly, MongoDB. So this MongoDB module that we installed or we have, we are calling upon it. And then object ID is something, if you hover over it, it should say it essentially is from your MongoDB module, you're calling object ID. What this means is you're using it, or MongoDB uses it in order to if you want to fetch any entry or you want to insert any entry, in order for your code to be able to get that information from MongoDB, we'll use this object ID functionality, and you'll see how we'll do that once we start writing our database setup code. After that, you have an empty object called collections. The reason we have this is we will create or we'll add some keys and values in here, and this is going to hold our collections for now. So you worked on cats.db. So in here, you would have had maybe breeds and facts as two of your collection names. In our case right now, we are creating Pinterest. So the different collections we'll have here is pins. So initially, we are going to set up our database to have a key pins inside, and we'll set it to be null. And once information is fetched from the database, we'll replace the value null with the entry we get or with the collection that we get from our database. So for now, var collections, pins is null. Okay. So currently we are initializing our collection. We just need one for now, which is pins. We are setting it to null. Now that we have this inside, again, these also variables that we Okay, these variables that we might want to reuse inside our function, the reason we are calling collections, client, and database outside is we will need to provide access to these variables to server.js. Okay, if they are defined within your function, setup function, the problem will be that server.js won't have access to these variables. Your functions will be bound by, your variables will be bound by the function, okay? So for that reason, some variables that server.js might need access to, we are initializing them outside. Currently, we are setting everyone's values to null, but later on, when we export these values to server.js, it will have access to the latest values because they were initialized outside. Does that make sense? Okay, in the setup function, we will make our connection. So we need to have all of this set up inside a function because we can't proceed with our code until we have made a connection with our database. The setup has taken place. And once that all happens, we have some value for client, database, and some information coming from MongoDB inside our collections. Only then can we export that information to other files that connect with our database.js file. Okay. Since we're doing it first time, it might sound like a lot, but let's just get into async, and once we practice it, you'll understand why the setup is like this. Inside our asynchronous function, we'll call the client variable and say await new connection with MongoDB. Inside that, we call Mongo client, like you must have done with coding challenge 6. So save this. Okay, the reason I don't need to write var client is because this is a variable that I've already initialized inside. Inside as in outside of my function. So here I'm just reassigning the value for this client variable. Initially it was null, but now we will use it to make a connection with MongoDB. Okay, so let's go back over here. Click on connect, drivers, and this string, we'll copy it. So just to repeat, under your MongoDB Atlas, you have database over here. If you click on it, you should be redirected to, yeah. Under MongoDB Atlas, you have database, right? That's where we were when we set up our database. Click on connect. Under drivers, you will be provided with a link, a connection link to include in your or integrate in your Node.js application. So copy this using this shortcut over here. And now we can go back to database.js, and within this brackets, single inverted commas, paste this. And whenever you use this, you're never going to have the password included. You need to replace it yourself, including the pointed brackets for security purposes. So I'm going to enter my password and save this.
The angle brackets?
No, you need to remove the angle brackets. I'm going to zoom in a little more. So client await new. We are calling the MongoDB module that we imported. From that, we have this class, which allows us to make Mongo client, which allows us to make a connection with our server. So within rounded brackets, we paste a connection link, and then we just make sure you close the bracket at the end. On your next line, we'll start creating our database. So we didn't have the MongoDB class in person, but in that recording, if you watched it, you remember that when you make a connection with your MongoDB database, even though a collection is not created on there, the first time you run your code, if you're trying to access a collection, if it's not there, it gets created automatically. All right. So database equals to await client DB. In here, we'll create a database. Okay. After that, what we need to do is we've initialized this collection to null, right? So we need to make sure that within our database, so in this cluster, we are creating a database. We need to call all of the collections that already exist in MongoDB. So now the following lines of code that we are going to create, the logic of it is, if a collection called pins already exists in our database, get those values from there and store it in this variable. However, if pins collection is not created, it doesn't exist in the database, then simply let it be null for now, but create a collection called pins in our database. So essentially, if the collection exists, get the information. If it doesn't exist, create the collection. Okay, so the way to write that is, let's create a variable called let listed collections, and this is going to hold the collections that we get from MongoDB. So await database dot list collections. Within curly brackets, we leave the first bracket over here is a filter for what kind of collections you want. Currently, we don't want any filter, so we're going to leave that empty. And the second parameter within this list collections function is that do you want all the information of your collections or just the names? So for now, we are checking if we have this collection called pins in our database or no. So name only, we'll set it to be true. Okay, this also needs to go in curly brackets. So within this list collection function, we have two parameters. Following this, we need to just make sure we are converting it to an array format for our convenience. So to array. So far, what we have is we've created a variable called listed collections. We are awaiting on our connection with the database. Once that happens, we are going to call the list collections function. We are not filtering any information. We only want the names. So name only true. And for our convenience, we are converting it to an array format using toArray. Okay. After this, we'll do that check. So let's simplify the information we've gotten and store it somewhere. So let names equals to listed collections, which is our variable that we just created. So we'll map out everything that is gotten and store it. So map collection singular, sorry, small c, because that's what our variable is called. Return collection, sorry, collection dot name. So for convenience, you know what? Let's try to print this out. So we'll see what we get from MongoDB when we run this code, listed collections. Okay, so we have the names of our collections from the database stored in this variable called names. Now we need to just have a part of code written that will compare if the information coming from our database matches this or not. If this is all too much for now, you just follow along and code. The database setup, usually this much part is going to be the same. Just the variable or the collection name might change based on what your project is. The database setup functionalities you can mostly reuse. So if it's code or syntax that seems too complicated right now, for this moment, it's okay. Just try to understand what each part of code is doing. So far, we've made a connection with our database. We are in these lines of code, we are getting the names of the collection that already exist in our database. For now, you and I know that's empty. Following this, let's make that comparison that we were talking about. So object dot keys. So for the keys within the collections variable that we have over here. So for the keys, as in pins is a key, okay? The value it's holding is null. So object.keys collections, for each value in here, we'll create an asynchronous function that will analyze each collection key, and we'll compare it with the information we have stored in this names variable. Okay, so if names dot includes the value that we currently have in our collection, then let that key hold that value. Okay, equals to await database dot collection. So what we're saying here is within our variable collections plural that we have created up here, we have one key called pins. It's holding the value null. Okay, so if within that collection, when we are going through it using a for loop, if any of the collection key names matches what we have in the database, then get that information from our database and store it inside our pins. So inside our variable collections, we are currently assessing each key that we have. So this essentially is pointing towards pins. Okay, so if you work with for loops, we are going through an array, okay, or we are going through an object. So for each key that we have in here, let's say in next class, we'll also have users. Let's set it currently to null. Okay, so when we go through the for loop, it's going to check for, is there a collection called pins in our database? If it is, then reassign or get those values from our database and assign it to this pins key. Is there a collection called users of our registered users? If yes, then assign that value to users over here. Replace null with the data we are getting from our database. Okay, so I'm going to erase this for now, and we'll go over it in our next class as well. So if this is the case that this does exist in the database, then get that information and store it within the pins key. Else, collection, you want to create that collection. So the way to do that is await database dot the create collection functionality. And in here, we are passing collection. So in our for loop, for each value within our collections, object, we are pointing it, or we are creating that variable over here. So every value that you have inside your collections object, if it exists, I have a typo here. If it exists, then you will just simply assign that value that you're getting to this pins key, else you're going to create that collection. The syntax can be a little complicated, but if when you're testing it out, the best way to understand it is maybe try to console log it at each point. So if you want to console.log the singular collection over here, we'll see what we get once our setup is complete. Okay, so another console log to look for. And let's console log names as well, right here. When we run our code, we'll see what we get. Names. Okay, save. Thereafter, we're almost close to done with our database setup. Just one thing I want to go over again is at the end of your setup functionality, how do we give server.js access to database.js? So now any file that calls the database.js file for that matter, in order to give them access to any information from here, so our database connection, our client, any pins data that we've gotten from our database, in order to give any file access to it, this last line is very important. Okay, this last line allows database.js file to give its variables, to give other files access to variables that we are storing here. So any file that calls database.js has access to the setup function. It has access to any collection that we pull from our database, client information, and etc. Okay, so we'll use this in server.js. Is everyone done writing this? Missing this comma, but that's okay. Let's go back to server.js. And now here we can we can use the database and set it up. So two things before we proceed is, in order to give server.js access to this file, we need to call upon it. So right at the beginning where we call each of our modules, we'll create a variable called database, and we'll ask it to fetch or require access to, inside the database folder, you have database.js. So you need to require it at the start of your page, just like you do with any other modules, because this is where our setup and connection is coming from. Okay, so this line of code at the top, and at the end, you need someone calling this setup function in order to make that connection and get that information. So that's going to happen in server.js over here. Inside your port, okay, right before you have your server up and running or this message displayed, you want to make sure your database connection has been created and you have established a connection. After that only you should be able to render these pages. So when you're calling your server on port 3000, right before that, await, inside our database module, we'll call the setup function. Okay, await database setup. What this does is it'll set up our function for us right when it's setting up the server as well. So when you see server started on port 3000 the next time, our database would have been created as well. Okay, now that this is done and our database is ready, we can go back to this root in server.js and now get that information from the user and store it in our database. So let data equals to the request parameter that we'll finally use, request.body. Okay, this means it's going to request for all of the information coming from the body of our page from the form. Okay, once we have this data, we can now push it into our database. So first thing we need to make sure is, has the user entered all the information? We have 3 fields, so they need to enter. So let's say object.keys. So if user has submitted and it's not empty, we are checking that. So if object.keys data length, as in it's not empty, or if it's a true value, so if it's less than equal to 0, then we might want to give an alert message. Okay, or if from the data let's say the user hasn't filled the title, right? So let's say any of these fields are empty. I'll put it in rounded brackets. So if data dot title is empty, or if data, sorry, exclamation mark, if data dot description hasn't been filled, or the exclamation mark basically is checking if it's empty or not. So if data dot description is not filled, if it's empty, or lastly data dot image. So if any of these fields are empty, we want to display an error message. Okay, so we'll send back response dot render. Okay, we don't want that information to get submitted to our database if any of the fields are empty. So if any of these fields are empty, that is all of the fields are empty or either one of them have not been filled, we want to send back an error message. All right, so pins slash new.egs, we don't want to proceed. Instead, we will give an error. So we'll pass a variable called error to the front end saying there was an issue creating this pin. Okay, but let's say, and at the end we do want to make sure we are returning, so we don't proceed to inserting the data. But if everything is submitted properly and these conditions aren't met, then we won't display the error message. That means the user has filled out this form properly, and we can now insert this pin into our database. So let pin equals to await database dot collections. Inside our collections variable, we have a key called pins. Into that collection, we want to insert one form information. So insert one data. Okay, what we are doing here is we are awaiting on our connection with the database, and we are using the collections variable to access the pins collection. Within that, we are using MongoDB's insert one functionality to insert this data on there. Once this is done successfully, in response, we will redirect the user to 301 slash pin. Now, just before I continue coding, 301 is like a status code. So if your page is not rendered successfully or there's an error, you'd show like maybe a 404 page not found error or something like that. 301 lets the browser know that this page or this action has been completed successfully. This route has been rendered right. So we can proceed. You're setting a status code, and thereafter you're redirecting them to pin $, sorry, rounded curly brackets, pin dot inserted ID to string. Okay. What we'll do is we will use this route to display the pin that you've just rendered, and we'll create that. Okay, what's happening here is within this route, we have a post method. We are requesting the form information. If any of the form fields are empty, if all of them are empty or either one of them are empty, we are going to display an error message. However, if all is successful and this if condition is not being checked into, then we are going to insert that form information into our database and redirect the user to see the information of the pin that we've just created. Now, so far, what we are doing is, you remember in our previous classes, we'd go to the root name slash, if I write Jenny, then it will say hello, Jenny. Okay, we haven't created this route yet, but what we would be doing inside this route is inside our pin, we are calling an ID. This ID is going to be of that value that we've just inserted. So the user can see that, okay, this is what you've successfully uploaded to your database. Okay, we haven't created that route. Before we do so, let's go back to new.egs. All right, because as soon as you're working with this error message thing, you want to make sure you're dealing with that on the front end as well. Previously, when we were rendering our pages, there was nothing being passed, right? So we'll set error to null. And if there is an error message passed, we do want to make sure it's displayed on the front end. So let's deal with our let's deal with our code. Yeah, here. So we want to make sure we're dealing with our code line by line. And if an error message is found, we want to make sure that's being displayed on our front end. So let's go back to new.egs. If the form is not able to be submitted correctly, right before this form tag, we'll display the error message. So the way to do that is using JavaScript's if-else condition. Again, just make sure you are opening and closing your tags correctly. So we are doing that. Within this, we'll have our if condition. So if an error variable is being passed to the front end, sorry, you want to make sure you're closing your brackets right. So I'll cut this, put it here. But if when new.egs is being rendered, if there is an error message, we want to make sure we're displaying it. So div class, again, alert, alert danger. Okay, so this should be the role of an alert message. And within this, we can now use EJS syntax to render that variable that we have coming from server.egs. So save. All right, so what this does is, if there is an error that is coming from server.js when this file is being rendered, then it will display that message. Going back to, I'll keep this open on the side. Going back to server.js over here, I'll zoom out just a tad. All right, we are making sure that the first time our page is being rendered, we are setting the error message to null. So in the get method, there is no possible error that could happen. The only possible errors that would come is in the post method if the user doesn't fill the form correctly. All right, so error currently by default, we'll set it to null. When the post method gets activated or called, that's when we'll actually display our error message. Okay, so by default, when this page is rendered the first time, we are going to have no error message displayed. Only if we have some value that is not null will we see this error message. Okay, so when we get to the form submission point, we will deal with it. Actually, you know what? Let's try to test our code before we write another route. So for redirect, I'm going to just comment out this line. And for now, let's do response.redirect. Let's say 301 slash a different route name for simplicity's sake for now, /. Okay, so for now we've not created this route. Let's just test out what we have so far. So if this all works out correctly, then we want the user to be redirected to our home page. Okay, let's test our code. I'm going to save this. I simply commented out this in our post method. And let's see if this works. Refresh our server, go back, refresh our page. What we're expecting is if we enter any actually, if we don't enter any information, submit, we should get an error message. Okay, have an error. Cannot convert null to object in server.js line 22. Okay. If data.length is less than equal to 0, then we should have this error. I'm going to print out data just to see what object it is. Sorry, console log. I know this is a lot for today, but just bear with me till the end of class. It's just a topic we need to get done with. So save, run server.js. Inside our pins route, if I hit submit, we are getting empty information. So okay, just this is one of our console logs that we're seeing right now. Okay, on line 22, data is empty, which is why we're getting this error because it's unable to convert that information. But that's okay. The rest of our code should still work. I'm going to run and debug this and get back to you about this error if it doesn't get fixed. Setup takes place properly. You see, this is all coming from database.js. We had several console logs on there. So let's see what's on line 16. On line 16, we are getting our list or our collections, our multiple collections that we have created. Currently, we are getting nothing. It's 0. It's empty. All right. On line 20 over here, we are displaying the names that is coming from our collections variable that we have created here. Okay, so this is what we have in our database. It was currently empty. In here, we have one collection called pins. Okay, and that collection is, so our connection to the database is happening successfully. Only thing is on form submission, we are getting an error. Our setup has taken place. So I'm going to minimize this, refresh our page, and let's just actually create a pin. So I'm going to create first pin. I'm going to get a random image from Google. I'm going to copy the link just to test out our code. My right click's now working. Okay, that's odd. Yes. Okay, I'm just going to go back. I'll test it out because we are still getting an error. I'm going to copy some random image address to fill out our form. Test description. Okay, and submit. Connection was reset because of our error. So run and debug. Going to go back. This is the data that's coming from our form, but cannot convert undefined file to object. So what's happening here? We're getting some issue with processing the image that's being sent by the form. Quest.body. One possible issue that I think the issue is that dot length is a function that should be outside. So this is my typo. If objects.keys, for this data object that's coming from the front end, I have to check the length outside. So after closing the rounded bracket, I'm pretty sure it should be this. So this is where our code was crashing. Our functionality should have come afterwards. And if this length now is, because it's a function, it's not part of our variable. When we say data.length, what we are insinuating is that data is an object that should have a key called length. That's not the case. Data is an object whose length, we are calling this JavaScript function, and we are trying to check if it's less than equal to 0. I'm going to run and debug this. It should work now. I'm going to go back to the home page. Click on new. Let's say first pin, image URL, some random link from online, and test description. Submit. And we are redirected to the home page. So yes, that was the error. Just to go back to server.js, this data should have closed. After that, we should have had the dot length functionality. Quickly, if we minimize this, go back to MongoDB. If you browse collections now, you should see that your pins collection has been automatically created and your first pin would have been submitted and should reflect online. Okay. Okay, let's go to your server.js. Scroll up. Scroll down. Okay, let's go to new.ejx. It's not database on it's a JavaScript file. But the problem is in new.ejs. So the if else condition, we have some control. Server.js. Is your value called description stated or called in the form? That's that shouldn't be it. Save, refresh your server. Let's go back to refresh your page. If you did make a mistake once, we are not dealing with what happens after that. Okay. And I think it is a lot to actually do for today. So we'll call it a day here. I'll go home and I'll record. We just have a last one part to cover, which is once this form submission does take place, how do we display it in our front end, right? So that 301 line that we commented out, I'll create a separate recording for that and I'll upload it on Blackboard today. And it should help you with your coding challenge 7. If you refer to the class code provided to you, I'm hoping coding challenge 7 isn't too challenging. So give it a try and let's go over it. Yes.
Like what kind of URL did you post into?
If you just go to Google and just search for any image, easiest way is Pexels is royalty free. I tend to go there. So if you search for Pexels on, this first link that appears, I just clicked on it, went to any image and just right clicked, copy image address. For any image that you find on the browser, you should be able to right click and copy image address.
Is that the same as copy image?
Yeah. Okay. If you copy it and paste it anywhere, you'll see that you get that image if you paste it in the browser. So I'll go home and create a recording for what happens next. Okay, that should help you.